All right. So let's talk about these strategies a little bit more. So what I'd like each group to share is their answers to these questions. When it's a good idea to use this strategy, an example of this strategy, and some limitations that this strategy might have. So let's start here at the top with the structural group.
Okay, so a good idea to use the structural negotiations is when you're trying to come to a conclusion to an argument, because it focuses on like everybody involved. An example would be like trying to find a solution to like a big problem, and our example of like solution. And then some limitations could be like when people disagree, and like having people with opposing viewpoints, because it doesn't really work if you're like stuck in like what
Rena, right?
Rena.
Rena. Yeah, so Rena, I think you do a great job of talking about some of the strengths and limitations of this approach, right? The structural approach definitely helps us to understand where everybody's coming from, but especially if it's like complex and people disagree, right? As you say, it's a lot harder to move ahead if you recognize, okay, we disagree on this thing, what are we going to do? Let's talk second about the strategic approach.
So we said, I feel like we strategy when we have a lot of stakes both parties. Example of this is the pipeline. This is kind of focused on the gains and losses. So this kind of goes on to solving the transit through. It's not really a bad strategy though. Because you're really focused on the gains, so you can have that cover the losses a little bit and really hit on those. So,
Yeah, Logan, right? Yeah, so Logan, I think that your group does a good job of talking about this strategy too, right? The strategic approach is maximizing gains, minimizing losses. It can be really good if your party or group really wants to win. One thing to think about is when it comes to conflict management strategies, right? A competitive approach suggests there's winners and losers, that there's a zero-sum game in order for one person to win, another person has to lose. And sometimes, right, there can be collaborative solutions to problems, so a strategic or competitive approach might ignore or not deal with some of the ways that we can collaborate to solve issues. So it's definitely a strategy we see a lot in place. What about the third group here on perceptual?
So a good time to use it when you're working from both sides of the arguments. We said like in the court of law, you cover a lot of ground with long-term solutions, and you don't necessarily need a solution right now. An example is international trade deals and court limitations, not immediate results. So you kind of come to an outcome like that you really need this right away. It's not a good time to use it. And it limits collaboration use and is purely objective. Someone has to lose at some level, and it can be considered zero-sum game. Someone has to lose.
Yeah. Right, so this approach really looks at how over time conflict management happens. So through something like a trade deal, right, there's a lot of history and context there. We've revised, we've changed, we've altered different trade deals over time. And one advantage is that this approach helps us to understand history and context behind a certain conflict. But as you say, it can fall into the same strategic trap when we're thinking about this in terms of gains and losses and so on, right? We tend to maybe ignore some of the collaborative approaches. One kind of way of thinking about a lot of the competitive approaches toward conflict management is hearing about like the metaphor of war being used a lot, right? So one party is gaining ground or losing ground. One party is like on the offense and so on. Like if we're using that terminology to describe a conflict, it's a very much an approach that there's winners and losers to that conflict. Behavioral. Let's talk about this one.
We said this negotiation strategy would be good in situations with like leadership positions, as well as in one where they're maybe trying to pull in a group of people. We really took the route of examples of using like presidential elections as well as presidents in general. A good example of the strategy, we said Obama was a really good public speaker. That was kind of a character trait that he had, like the kind of behavior he had that really drew a lot of people in, and he was very influential with that kind of stuff. It can also do the opposite, where obviously a lot of people don't like Biden or don't like Trump, and so like that kind of pushes them away or even pull them closer because maybe they do like that kind of style. The reason we said there's some limitations is for that exact reason. Obviously, one behavior trait might work very well for some people, but it'll be the complete opposite for other people. So it's what might pull people in will also draw people in.
Yeah, right. So this approach is very much focused on the personalities of people that might be engaged in a conflict, right? So you all bring up example of recent presidents as like their personality or charisma or following, who likes them, who doesn't, plays a really big role in whether or not we agree or disagree with their arguments. And then in the same way, right, personality, characteristics, and so on will be a really big part of a lot of negotiations and discussions. Again, if you followed any of the the infrastructure and spending bill discussions in the U.S. Senate, you know that Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema, who are the two most moderate Democrats in the Senate, right, have been a lot of the focus and discussion, and their personalities and characteristics and approaches have emerged in large part as how various people trying to get a deal together might be negotiating, right? So personalities, right, we're humans, we have flaws, and our personalities are going to cloud our judgment or change the way that we choose to deal with an issue. So examining personalities is definitely a really big part, but it doesn't get at the full picture. There's other things that we might do too as part of negotiation that go beyond our personality. If you're representing a group or population, even if your personality is a little bit different, ideally you're going to try to fit with the needs of that population, even if it goes against your personal wishes or desires, right? So personality can play a big role, but there can be elements outside of personality that affect our negotiations too. Lastly, let's hear from the integrative group.
Yeah, so integrating really focuses on like a win-win situation for both sides.
Uh-huh.
We said it was a good idea to use this strategy among a group of friends where you both want to succeed and you don't want to hurt the other person. And an example of the strategy would be just that, like two friends going out to eat, where they may not want the same thing, but maybe they can agree on a restaurant that can cater the whole appetite.
Yeah.
But the limitation of this strategy is that you're not always going to do what you want. So at some point in time, there does have to be compromise in the past, and it may not be the compromise.
Yeah. So collaboration is something that we ideally want, but not every conflict is going to be able to resolve in collaboration. So if you and a friend are both trying to apply for the same job, and there's only one job, there's only that much budget available, like maybe something works out and they get a different job, but only one person is going to get that, right? So there are situations where a single solution and integrative approach doesn't always work, but it can be a really effective way in a lot of situations to, instead of approaching as competition, approach as what is a solution that everybody wants. So again, knowing these different strategies is a really good idea as you're preparing for the midterm and other things to know in class going forward. One way that you might use this in something like your essay for the class, right, is you might examine negotiation strategies that are used in something like a conflict. So this week we've been talking about the Iran nuclear deal. We can talk about everything from the current spending bill, the Affordable Care Act, the APA. Talk about policies in the last several years. You could look at it from a very political public policy route. You could look at international relations and conflict, right, on issues such as Afghanistan, Iraq, and a lot of other international conflicts as well. You could look at this in the context of kind of social and cultural issues too, including COVID-19, media, television coverage surrounding it and other issues, and so on. So there's a lot of different ways that you can apply and think about these strategies in more detail. What I want to go over are some of the different tactics and ways that we essentially engage in the negotiation process with others. So these are kind of listed out on your study guide as the last new terms that you need to know going into the exam. So these are some of the ways that we use different tactics of bargaining as well as multiple issue negotiation, win-win negotiation, interest bargaining. So these are some of the different approaches. And then we'll kind of wrap up with a discussion about issues surrounding ethics and culture and the way that they play into negotiation. Again, as a reminder, negotiation is about coming to the table with other people to reach some type of common or agreed upon solution. It's not a mediator who is a person outside of the conflict who engages, nor is it coercion where one person decides or one group decides what to do. The idea is that it might not be what everybody wants, but it is a solution that we all come to and agree upon together. So these all play into the really common strategy of negotiation. So think about, again, these as the issues that are being negotiated or talked about. So we'll talk about these and try to differentiate these in a little bit more detail. The first thing to look at is the role of positional bargaining, right? And that's something that we see used a lot of times in conflict management, especially if somebody is a representative or participant in the context of a group, right? So the former Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, was an example of a positional bargainer, right? So you might think about Israel's geographic location, its history of tension with Iran, its concerns about Iran nuclear proliferation, and in the context of something like the Iran nuclear deal, countries such as Israel is going to be really concerned about the issue of proliferation and maybe is more likely to take a harder line on Iran on this topic, right? So as a result, Prime Minister of Israel is very concerned with this approach and wants to take a strong position. So in this way, positional bargaining is essentially staking your claim, figuring out where you come from on this topic and arguing on behalf of that topic. Another example, right, is if you think about a prosecutor or a defense attorney in a case, they are taking the position of advocating on behalf of or against a particular client. Somebody such as divorce attorneys, right, are taking the position of people negotiating or working through a divorce settlement. So positional bargaining is really focused on taking the role that you're assigned to take and arguing on behalf of that. Member of Congress, right, ostensibly has that position too, where they, represent either a state or a geographic district within a state and attempt to advocate for issues based on what they see as appealing to the needs or interests of their constituents. Single issue numerical bargaining, right, is the numbers game. So one example that gets brought up a lot is the idea of like haggling. So if you've watched the show like Comm, that's an example. Another example that was kind of weird and pretty dystopian. Earlier in the summer, I decided to just like watch some silly TV, and there was a Netflix show called Marriage or Mortgage. I don't know if anybody's seen that, but it's like it's a couple that has a certain amount of money. They have to put that either toward a home loan or toward something like wedding. It's actually really sad because the people who chose wedding like immediately had COVID-19 that happened afterwards. But in a case like that, right, it's single issue numerical bargaining. It's you have X amount of money, where's that money going to go? So something like haggling or negotiating a deal, right? So if you've ever used something like Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist and so on, right? You've done single issue numerical bargaining. There's a lot of different tricks and approaches about how you do that, but it generally means that there are numbers, there's something quantifiable that is being debated and talked about. And oftentimes, this is one of the cleanest and easiest ways to do a negotiation. The big reason for that is that the thing that is being negotiated is really clear to identify. So for instance, if you think back to our example of the Iran nuclear deal on Wednesday, one thing that was brought up were the number of uranium enrichment facilities that Iran could have. And that number was sort of capped at around 3,000. And so that is used to help us understand where the line is drawn. You might also think about the percentage of uranium enrichment that Iran was allowed to do, right? So 90% or more, typically enough to make a nuclear bomb. Or even something such as the number of years that this deal would be into effect. So if we're looking at any one of those issues, right, and we're trying to negotiate that single issue, then that single issue numerical bargaining. If you're debating your grade, right, and you reach out to a professor and you're like, hey, I think I deserve this grade, I have this amount of points in the class, so on, right, you're also using that strategy. There's a single quantifiable thing. Single issue non-numerical bargaining is a lot more challenging, and it's a lot more challenging for one specific reason, and that is that everybody has to agree on how to measure or make sense of the thing that is being negotiated or talked about. Right? If it's a number, that's one thing. That's really easy. But if it's something like a grade where it factors into like participation and other elements, right? Both the student and the teacher have to have an understanding about how that grade is being measured and evaluated. There's a difference in terms of how the student and how the teacher view what's in A, what's in B, and so on. There's going to be a pretty big difference in their ability to negotiate or talk about that topic. So non-numerical bargaining is challenging because since it's not quantified, each party might look at that in a really different way. So for instance, how should a RAND behave in regards to material loss? What should they be doing or not doing? What is the role of somebody like sort of an evaluator or reviewer who comes in and monitors the RAND's nuclear activity? What are they expected to do? What is considered to be okay behavior? What's considered suspicious behavior? A big source of conflict here was that a lot of nations, including Israel, were concerned. They were like, we think that Iran might be proliferating or violating the agreement. And so there was a lot of question about to what degree they were following this non-numerical measure of behaving or acting in accordance with the agreement, right? So one way to manage conflict when it's about a single issue that can't necessarily be negotiated in a numerical way is figuring out how everybody in the conflict understands the issue. So for instance, if, it's you and another person deciding how much labor you should do with chores, you might think about, okay, what counts as a chore? And as a result, how you can divide that up. If what you think of as a chore is basic tasks such as doing the garbage and the laundry and so on, what they think the other person thinks of as a chore might include a lot of other things such as tidying, cleaning off surfaces and so on, you're going to have a very different agreement and might not understand each other very well. So figuring out how to define the issue is really important here. Multiple issue negotiation, right, is the idea that essentially in dispute are a lot of different issues. And as a result of that, you can find solutions that are able to account for these. So again, the broader issue of how Iran might deal with its quantity of uranium, along with its nuclear umbrella, along with its number of things that it can do with enrichment, and so on, right? In other words, multiple issue bargaining means there's a lot of different things at play here. This can actually be a good thing in a lot of situations with negotiation, because even though there's a lot of things to figure out, different people are going to see issues as differently important. So one way that you can think about it if you're in a conflict, or you're trying to deal with a conflict situation, is to have each person in the group rank order the different issues that they see as the most or least important. So for instance, maybe one country is really concerned about the number of centrifuges that Iran has, and that's a really big concern. Iran says, we're not as concerned about the number of centrifuges, but we are really concerned about how much we can enrich this, and what percentage of enrichment we can use. Because an issue might be more important to one person than another, it might be easier to make a deal by allowing a strategic concession. I'm not as worried about the number of centrifuges, so it's okay if it's a little bit more. But I am worried about this. Can you give a little bit on this one? So oftentimes we'll reach a compromise solution because a topic that's really important to one person is less important to somebody else. So multiple issue negotiation is oftentimes a really useful way for us to better understand what's important to who and why. A win-win negotiation, right, is generally a tactic that's trying to create a win-win or ideal outcome. So it's an outcome that benefits everybody. An example of this approach could be something like Iran gives up its entire nuclear arsenal, which is what a lot of countries would want who are concerned about Iran. However, it will provide shelter and security through something like a nuclear umbrella, which we mentioned on Wednesday is the idea that by forming an agreement or alliance with another country, they know that if they were ever attacked and involved nuclear weapons, that they would receive the support and backing of another country for nuclear weapons. The United States and Japan have that, right? Japan does not have a nuclear weapons stockpile because they're allies with the United States. They know that the United States could use them if their ally was attacked, right? The win-win might be, we'll give that up, but we'll have the security, which is the thing we want. And then we have this idea of interest bargaining, right? So interest bargaining is essentially dealing with the structural approach that we mentioned earlier, where you're trying to understand holistically what the conflict is, who's involved, and so on. So interest bargaining is generally dealing with the idea that we develop a shared understanding of the problem, that is, we all understand what the problem is, and we consider the best ways to address it on the whole, considering the interests and issues and so on that people have. So, for instance, you might look at the problem altogether and say, okay, we're not in agreement about the amount of nuclear weapons that Iran possesses. Let's figure out how the United States views it, the European Union views it, and so on, and work together to come up with a common solution on the topic. Where this differs from other strategies of negotiation is that in another strategy, maybe somebody is concerned with issues in a different way. But instead, we all come together and say, we're all interested in addressing this topic, let's figure it out and hash it out. So it tends to be a more collaborative approach. Maybe you do something like create a Google Doc, or have everybody talk together at the same time about the topic. That can be one way of doing interest bargaining, where you're looking at the topic and you're all talking about it together as a group, or in something like a G7 summit, where different parties are working together to have a conversation on the issue. So, given these different tactics and strategies that we use when it comes to conflict management, right, there's a lot of issues that might come up involving ethics. Ethics being, of course, notions of right or wrong. What is just or unjust? How should we behave or be ethical? Because, let's be honest, if you've ever tried to purchase a used car, you probably know that not all negotiation is particularly ethical. One reason for this is that people are not necessarily honest about negotiation, including what they have to offer, what they want, and so on. For instance, if somebody is selling you a used car and they say, oh, this is just like new, it's in great shape, and so they offer a pretty high price, you buy it, you discover, like, it's total lemon, and you drive it for 10 miles and it breaks down, well, that affects the negotiation because the thing they used as leverage, quality, turned out not to be the case. Another thing is what's known as a worst alternative to a negotiated agreement. In other words, what happens if we don't work together? One really big example of this that has been brought up in the context of U.S. politics is the idea of the debt ceiling. How many of you have heard or seen news cover this? Yeah, you've seen a lot of nodding, right? So, the United States has debt, right? It's pretty large debt. And so there's what's known as a debt ceiling or cap on the amount of debt that we can have and the amount that we can borrow. And so for the past several years, right, Congress has been passing an increase of the debt ceiling to increase the amount that we can borrow relative to our spending. And so one of the issues that keeps coming up is we hit the debt ceiling, there's this like very political and partisan-oriented debate, we eventually get it raised, but the specter of what happens when we don't reach the debt ceiling, or when we reach the debt ceiling and we don't increase it, is one that a lot of people use as a worst alternative to a negotiated agreement. This is where we've seen things such as a government shutdown, right, where a lot of major facilities are still on closed. There's a fear that we would default on our debt and that the credit rating of our debt would go down, therefore raising our interest rate, right? So in a case like this, the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement says we have to work together and we have to find a solution or else this bad thing will happen. So that can potentially be an ethical issue if the worst alternative is not honestly presented. So even in a situation like our failure to reach an agreement on the debt ceiling, there are some like emergency measures and actions that can be taken to extend the length that things continue to run before it. So this is an issue for us to think about with ethics too. Also the ethics of if it's an important issue to resolve and figure out what happens if you can't resolve this and work together. The use of threats and extreme cases, right, is another big issue that affects negotiation and risks getting us into coercion. So there's two major strategies that we can oftentimes see in negotiation, especially on like a single issue, especially a single issue numerical, right? And that's a foot in the door versus a door in the face. So foot in the door, right, is to start with a super flexible and negotiable offer and go up from there, right? So maybe somebody says, oh, I could offer this for somewhere around $6,000. And they say, great, that sounds great. Okay, well, how about I offer it for $8,000? You start with something reasonable, and then you escalate from there, right? Door and face is the opposite, where you argue for something entirely unreasonable, you grandstand on that, and then you're eventually able to negotiate it down to something else. Right? One of the things that we talk about a lot of tactics in negotiation is that your starting offer? Why would you start with something like that, right? So oftentimes people who choose the absolute best outcome they have or something even better than what they hope to get out of the negotiation. And then they work down to something. Oh, I can't part with this for less than $15,000. Really? 15? What about 13,000? Well, okay, I guess we can do that, right? If you start high and start with something extreme, then somebody is more likely to interpret the next option as a lot more reasonable by comparison. So the use of these kinds of extreme cases is one way that we might use negotiation, but can also pose escalations. Again, especially if it's dishonest with the other person about what you want and how you want to get that. We'll talk more later in the class about the issue of the prisoner's dilemma, which I brought up earlier, right, and how that can factor into our negotiation too. And cultural sensitivity is important. The ways that different cultures and groups might be talking about, thinking about, or understanding are elements of communication in conflict is a really big deal too. So how people might measure an issue that's non-numerical, bargaining, what does it mean to be at peace, what does it mean to have nuclear weapons, that plays a really big role across different cultures and how they might define these ideas. Right? Not all cultures are a good fit for things including interest bargaining. One major difference here on strategies bargaining is that in a lot of Western cultures, we see the environment as something to be manipulated. That you can change the environment or you can change our way of negotiating and dealing with the topic. Whereas a lot of non-Western cultures see the environment as something we can participate in and not necessarily manipulate, which means that interest bargaining might be less of a good option because it's seen as something that you can't necessarily change as easily. You can't negotiate your different interests and find a common solution if your positions on topics can't change as easily. So what I'd like us to do is return back to the groups that we worked on earlier in this class. So we already talked about some of the ethical and cultural issues around interest bargaining. So let's have, and we'll go kind of in the same order. So like this is group 1 that shares first. This is group 5 that shares last. We'll have group 1 focus on positional bargaining. Group 2, single issue numerical. 3, single issue non-numerical. 4, multiple issue. And group 5 on win-win. So write your names on a new sheet. You can practice as well. And I'd like each group to talk about, first of all, how ethics might be a concern with this tactic of negotiation. And second of all, the ways that culture might play into this tactic. So take some time to explore this tactic of negotiation a little bit and be prepared to talk about some of the ways that ethics and culture play into this. Go ahead and finish up your current thought or idea. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about, again, the role that ethics and culture might play. So let's start here with this first group on positional bargaining.
So it says that like parties are always honest, so people
Great. Single issue numerical.
So the first thing is dishonesty and manipulation of numbers and proxies. For example, too much of our product that we get or lose it for certain prices might not. And then third, the second one is that people could be more likely to be honest and upfront about price, what number, and people who start to use different value.
Yeah. Single issue non-numerical.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about like some of the ethical concerns being like this alternative to using while we just want to be not being honest about what we have, but also the big cultural that we talked about was that depending on background and also what countries sometimes values defined differently. So especially with this type of issue, if you're not on the same ground as what you're defining as valuable for that, it's going to be really hard.
Yeah. Multiple issues.
So it says like for ethics, figuring out what kind of negotiation into multiple different items or agree other issues and because I feel like we said social curious to understand why we need different issues in different ways within a negotiation and creating what is something simple culture. We can also see how they have dealt with issues in the past too, and understand those things.
Great, thank you. And win-win.
So for our ethics question, we brought up the fact that even though people seem like they may want to benefit from this negotiation, they're not going to money, kind of like the used car example earlier. And then the way culture would play into this would be that some cultures are more competitive, so they wouldn't use win-win as their primary technique, whereas some cultures are more collective and would want to benefit as their primary technique.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate each of you sharing. You know, there's a couple common threads that really stand out to me. First of all, the issue of value being really different across cultures, right? Individualistic versus collectivist is a big element there. If harmony is really important to the group, that's going to be seen as a much bigger aspect of negotiation. Also, the role of trust, right? In all of these issues of negotiation, if you're worried about dishonesty, presenting information fairly, including something like a price and so on, that plays a really big role in being ethical when it comes to engaging in conflict, being willing to be trusting and to trust the other person. And that can be a really challenging thing to continue to work on over time. So we'll keep talking about these issues. We talked a little bit about how we use these kinds of negotiation tactics, like single and multiple issue bargaining. We talked about the role of ethics, right, in terms of doing the right thing and figuring out the best approach. We've also talked a little bit about culture and some of the ways that we might value or view different elements of a conflict negotiation in a very different way. What's important to one person might be really important to somebody else in a different way. So on Friday, we have a third study circle Remember that if you've already done your study circle, 2 weeks from your date, you should turn in both a reflection and your peer feedback to Canvas. Both those assignments are available for you to submit to. Otherwise, I hope that you all have a great rest of your day. Pass forward the news sheet that you worked on for today for attendance. And I will see you all again for our study circle on Friday.